Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into the nuts and bolts of a pretty dramatic F1 story.
We are indeed. We're looking at Ferrari's power unit roller coaster.
Exactly. How they went from, well, arguably the strongest engine in 2019, though, with some big questions attached,
Lots of questions.
to having a really tough time and then fighting their way back. Yeah, trying to piece together that whole narrative. Because Ferrari, I mean, they are F1 history in so many ways. Most poles, most wins, most titles.
Absolutely. Which makes that dip, particularly in 2020, so striking. How does a team like that end up with, as some said, the worst engine?
That's the puzzle, isn't it? So this deep dive, we're going to track the alleged rule bending in 2019, the fallout, and then the engineering fight back.
Sounds good. Where should we start? The controversy.
Let's jump right in there. 2019, the SF90, it was fast. Really fast sometimes.
Especially on the power tracks, right? Monza, Spa. The straight line speed advantage was, well, pretty stark.
And that obviously got other teams thinking and talking. Red Bull especially.
They were definitely suspicious. The main focus became how Ferrari was managing their fuel flow.
Okay, so let's talk about that fuel flow meter. It's a critical piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Can you break down how it works for us? Because it sounds quite complex.
Sure. So the FIA, that set the rules, has this limit, 100 kilograms of fuel per hour, max.
Right.
To enforce that, every car has this FIA-mandated fuel flow meter. It uses an ultrasonic principle.
Okay, ultrasonic.
Yeah, it sends sound waves through the fuel, measures the time difference for the waves traveling with and against the flow.
Ah, clever.
From that difference, it calculates the fuel's velocity, and knowing the pipe diameter, it gets the precise flow rate.
And it's checking this constantly.
Oh yeah, thousands of times a second. 2,200 samples per second, I think the source is mentioned. Both the team and the FIA are monitoring this data feed.
So it's supposed to be foolproof. But the suspicion was that Ferrari had found a way around it. How?
Well, a couple of theories floated around. One was maybe storing fuel after the meter.
Right, but that got shut down quickly.
Yeah, the FIA issued technical directives clarifying that wasn't allowed. The more persistent theory, and the one that gained more traction, involved exploiting the sampling rate.
Exploiting the sampling rate. How?
Okay, so the fuel pumps, they don't deliver a perfectly smooth stream. They pulse very rapidly. The idea was maybe Ferrari figured out how to time these fuel pulses to deliver a little extra fuel between the moments the meter was actually taking its measurement.
So like sneaking it through in the tiny gaps when the meter wasn't looking?
Kind of. If you could synchronize those pulses just right with the meter's sampling frequency, you might exceed the instantaneous limit briefly, but the average the meter reported over time would still look legal.
Wow, that sounds incredibly difficult to achieve technically.
Extremely, if that's what was happening. But that was the core suspicion.
In Red Bull, they didn't just sit on these suspicions, did they?
No, they were quite strategic. Instead of a direct accusation, which is hard to prove, they started submitting technical queries to the FIA.
Ah, the clarification route.
Exactly. They designed hypothetical systems that could potentially trick a fuel flow sensor in the way they suspected Ferrari might be doing, and asked the FIA, hey, would this be legal?
That's quite a tactic, sort of forcing the FIA's hand.
Pretty much. And the FIA responded by issuing these technical directives, or TDs.
What did the TDs say?
Essentially, they explicitly outlawed the kinds of methods Red Bull had asked about. Things like manipulating the signal or exploiting the sampling frequency.
The timing of this.
Well, almost immediately after these TDs came out, Ferrari's straight-line speed advantage seemed to diminish, quite noticeably on some tracks.
Which obviously just added more fuel to the speculation.
It certainly did. People drew their own conclusions.
Then came the really murky part, the FIA investigation and that confidential agreement.
Right. So the FIA looked into it, but instead of a public finding or penalties, they announced they'd reached a private settlement with Ferrari.
Why private? What was the justification?
The official line, according to the sources, was partly about protecting Ferrari's intellectual property, specifics of their engine design.
Okay.
And in return for this confidentiality, Ferrari apparently agreed to help the FIA improve power unit monitoring across the board and assist with other regulatory stuff.
Like hiring a hacker to catch hackers almost.
That comparison was made, yes. But the other teams were furious.
I can imagine.
7 non-Ferrari teams released this joint statement. They were shocked by the lack of transparency, demanded full disclosure. They were really unhappy.
Understandably. They wanted to know what exactly the FIA had found or not found, and why it was settled behind closed doors, hinting at legal action even.
They did hint at it, yeah. The core issue was the secrecy. It bred suspicion.
And the FIA's counter. Why could they just make a ruling?
Their position seemed to be that while they had strong suspicions, they perhaps lacked the absolutely concrete, undeniable proof the smoking gun needed to win a legal fight if Ferrari contested it. And they likely wanted to avoid a long, expensive, potentially damaging court battle.
So, a pragmatic solution for the FIA, maybe, but one that left a lot of questions unanswered.
Definitely. And regardless of what Ferrari was doing, the technical directives and the increased scrutiny had clear consequences.
What changed specifically in terms of monitoring?
Well, much closer monitoring of fuel flow, obviously. New sensors were mandated for the hybrid systems, the MGUH, MGUK.
To track energy deployment more closely.
Precisely. And stricter limits on oil consumption. There was that whole other theory about burning oil for performance.
Ah, yes, the controlled oil leak idea. Using oil in the intercooler somehow.
Yeah, potentially getting a tiny bit of oil into the combustion chamber via the intake air for a small power boost. That was also clamped down on hard by the FIA.
Okay, so all these clarifications, new sensors, tighter checks, leading into 2020. And it seems like the wheels, well, it kind of came off for Ferrari that year.
It was a dramatic drop-off. The SF1000 in preseason testing was immediately way off the pace, like nearly a second a lap slower than the SF90.
A second a lap, that's huge in F1 terms.
Massive. And the estimates pointed to a significant power loss, maybe around 65 horsepower down, compared to the 2019 unit.
Just from the engine changes forced by the TDs and the settlement.
That seemed to be the main factor, yes.
Yeah.
But it had a knock-on effect.
How so?
The 2020 car's aerodynamics,
Yeah.
the whole chassis philosophy. It had been designed around the expectation of having that powerful 2019 engine.
Ah, so when the engine power wasn't there.
The car was too draggy. The aero concept didn't work anymore. It was producing too much resistance for the weaker engine to punch through efficiently. A fundamental mismatch.
And the results on track reflected that, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
6th in the Constructors' Championship, their worst season in something like 40 years.
Wow. Even reports of their own test driver calling it the worst engine on the grid. That's quite a fall.
A very, very difficult year for them. But, Ferrari doesn't stay down for long. They clearly knuckled down for 2021.
Right, the recovery phase. What did they focus on? Obviously, the power unit was priority number one.
It had to be. They put a huge amount of engineering effort into redesigning elements of the PU, the 1.6-liter turbo engine itself, plus the hybrid components, the MGUH and MGUK.
Any specific innovations stand out from the sources?
One thing they talked about was the super fast head.
Super fast head.
Yeah.
Sounds impressive.
It wasn't about getting more volume of air and fuel in, but increasing the speed of that mixture as it entered the cylinder.
Okay, why does the speed matter?
Faster flow helps with fuel atomization. Basically, it breaks the fuel down into finer droplets, mixing it more thoroughly and evenly with the air.
And better mixing means?
A faster, more complete, more efficient combustion. You extract more energy from the same amount of fuel, essentially, getting back performance within the rules.
Clever. What else on the engine side?
They also tweaked the turbo system. Went for a slightly smaller compressor, apparently.
Why smaller?
A smaller compressor can spin up faster, which reduces turbo lag, that delay before the boost kicks in. It also helps the MGUH recover energy from the exhaust more effectively.
Makes sense.
And they relocated the intercooler, the thing that cools the air after the turbo compresses it.
To get colder air into the engine.
Exactly. Colder air is denser, means more oxygen molecules packed in, which again helps combustion efficiency and power.
So lots of detailed refinements on the engine. Did it bring back all the lost power?
The report suggested these engine changes alone clawed back maybe 20 horsepower initially. So not the full 65-ish they lost, but a very significant step in the right direction.
And engine development wasn't the only story, right? Because F1 had those development freezes in the token system around that time?
Correct. Major aero and chassis updates were restricted. Teams got 2 tokens to spend on significant redesigns for 2021, mainly as a cost-saving measure due to the pandemic.
But they could still work on smaller things.
Yes, areas like side impact structures, some minor aero bits, basic suspension layouts, cooling systems, those were generally open for development. And Ferrari did make lots of smaller tweaks to the SF21 to reduce drag.
And how did they use their precious 2 tokens? That was quite interesting.
It was very strategic, actually. Instead of spending them directly on, say, a new front wing or floor, they spent them on redesigning the gearbox casing.
The gearbox. Why?
Because changing the gearbox housing, under the rules, then allowed them to change the bodywork immediately surrounding it at the rear of the car. Crucially, this included the rear suspension mounting points.
Ah, so it was an indirect way to tackle their aero problems at the rear.
Precisely. They could reshape the whole rear end, improve the airflow, reduce drag, increase downforce, all without spending tokens directly on aero surfaces. Some sources suggested they took inspiration from Mercedes's successful rear suspension design.
That's smart, working the regulations. Did it help with the car's handling? The 2020 car seemed quite tricky.
It seemed to. Improving rear-end stability and grip was a known issue, especially for Leclerc. These changes likely contributed to making the car more predictable.
So a combination of engine gains and these clever token-enabled aero adjustments. How did Ferrari feel heading into 2021?
Cautiously optimistic, I'd say. Bonatto, the team principal then, estimated the engine gains alone were maybe worth 1/10 of a second per lap. He said it would take a few races to see the car's true potential.
And how did it look early on?
Definitely better. They were running 4th in the championship after the first couple of races, a clear improvement. And spoiler alert, based on the source timing, by race 5, they managed a 2nd-place finish, although the other car didn't finish that one. Still, a big step up.
It really is quite the turnaround, but looking back, those initial suspicions, the 2019 stuff, it wasn't just a one-year thing, was it? Some sources trace it back further.
That's true. Aidan Millward's analysis, for instance, points out that questions about Ferrari's PU development really started bubbling up around 2017.
Coinciding with rule changes meant to maybe rein in Mercedes a bit?
Potentially, yeah. And then in 2018, there was that big Ferrari power unit upgrade around the Canadian GP. That really raised eyebrows the size of the performance jump, especially on power circuits.
And there was that other theory floating around too, the twin battery idea.
Right, the speculation that maybe they were using 2 batteries but only 1 sensor, potentially allowing them to deploy more electrical energy than permitted.
Did the FIA look into that?
They did. They even mandated a 2nd sensor on Ferrari's ERS system for a while. Though how effective that was, or what it proved, remains a bit debated.
So a pattern perhaps of performance fluctuations coinciding with FIA scrutiny and those technical directives.
You can certainly interpret the timeline that way. Periods of strong straight-line speed followed by TDs, and then maybe a slight drop-off. And remember that incident in Abu Dhabi 2019.
The fuel discrepancy.
Yeah, Leclerc's car. A significant difference found between the fuel declared pre-race and the actual amount measured in the car. It just added another layer of questions about fuel flow accuracy or manipulation.
And we mentioned the other team's reaction to the confidential settlement. They weren't quiet about it.
Not at all. That joint statement from the 7 non-Ferrari-powered teams was pretty unprecedented, expressing shock, demanding transparency, questioning the FIA's process.
Really putting pressure on the FIA and Ferrari.
Definitely. They wanted answers on why the FIA felt it couldn't prove a breach and why the deal had to be secret.
And the FIA's stance remained consistent. Lack of definitive proof, avoiding legal battles.
Pretty much. They maintained they acted within their remit, but perhaps lacked that irrefutable evidence for formal sanctions, hence the settlement route. It's complex.
An interesting side effect, mentioned in some sources, is that all this suspicion around Ferrari might have actually pushed Mercedes harder.
Yeah, the idea that the perceived threat from Ferrari in 2019 spurred Mercedes to develop an even stronger power unit for 2020. F1 development never stands still.
It's a constant arms race. But for Ferrari, the immediate, undeniable consequence of all that scrutiny and the FIA's actions was that very tough 2020 season.
Absolutely. The performance drop was the clear outcome.
So let's try and wrap this up. We've traced this arc, the 2019 dominance and controversy, the deep struggles of 2020 after the clampdown, and then the methodical engineering recovery into 2021.
It really highlights just how complex F1 is, doesn't it? The fine line between innovation and the regulations, how teams constantly push those boundaries.
And the huge impact scrutiny and rule clarifications can have. It's not just about building a fast car. It's about navigating this incredibly intricate technical and political landscape.
And it shows the resilience required. Recovering from a setback like 2020 takes immense effort and clever thinking, especially under budget caps and development restrictions.
Which leaves us with a thought for you, the listener. Thinking about 2019, was Ferrari brilliantly exploiting gray areas in the rules, or did they cross a line?
And was that confidential agreement the right way to handle it for the good of the sport, or did the lack of transparency cause more harm?
What does this whole saga tell us about that constant tension between pushing technological limits and enforcing the rules in motorsport? There aren't always easy answers.
Definitely not. It's worth digging into the different viewpoints and the sources we looked at.
Absolutely. It just goes to show the quest for speed at the absolute peak of motorsport is always going to be full of complexity, controversy, and probably a few unanswered questions.